Namaste.
Namaste.
Welcome to another Atharva Conversation series. And today we have with us a well-renowned public intellectual and a thinker, writer, Sri Aravinda Neelakanthan with us to discuss on a very interesting topic, going beyond Dharampal. Our country's history has been mired in controversy through various distortions and peddling of agenda through a group of vested interest historians. Among them, we find Dharampal as a unique figure. Dharampal was not an established historian, so why at all bother about Dharampal?
Namaste. A very apt way of talking about Dharampal would be Dharampal is not only an professional historian, the conventional sense of the word, he is also no establishment historian. No, because the establishment historians, the colonial historians, even historians like Jagannath Sarkar or R.Z. Mazumdar, they followed a particular template that has been given to them by the British colonial intelligence. They were great scholars, no doubt about that. They were great scholars, but they followed that particular framework, and it essentially facilitated the later Marxist takeover of the history establishment. Because colonialism and Marxism, they are like cousins. Just like how Marxism is a mimetic clone of Abrahamic religions, the same way it is also closely related cousin of colonialism. So once you get the colonial framework, then it is very easy for you to devolve into Marxist historiography. So that is what happened in Indian history. And in this, Dharampal stands in a very marked different way. He created an entirely different framework. He created a completely different way of looking at history with data. That is the most important thing. Of course, in that recent book by Dilip Chakrabarty, he shows that the nationalist historians of ancient India, they have all been using the data properly. They never distorted the data to fit their theory with a capital T. Whereas in the case of Dharampal, the task was even tougher because he was taking data from the late medieval and the early modern eras of the history. And he was taking actually the data from the transition time. And he was showing that a particular system, without getting updated, without getting adapted to the modern challenges and opportunities, was getting completely endangered, extinct, and it was even getting abused by the narrative. And he was showing that no, this system is very good. And that is why Dharampal is very important. Dharampal is important because, let me paraphrase Marx himself, the purpose is not to just study history, but to create history or rewrite history, something like that. The same way, well, that was all for Marxists in terms of the vested interest of ideology. In the case of Dharampal, Dharampal actually showed us how we can discover the past, and through the past, we can rebuild our future. And when we tell that Dharampal is important, we mean not just as a historian, but as a person who has shown us our own self.
Thank you, Aravindanji, for that opening remarks on the fresh aspect of looking at history given by Dharampal, which is in fact a continued tradition of nationalist historians. Have the works of Dharampal attained the critical mass, and are we at a point that we need to go beyond Dharampal?
Now, every good historian, every good social scientist wants himself to be relegated to the past. Take his work, he wants the society to take the work and move forward with it. Particularly in Indian tradition, that is very important. While you pay respect to the great teachers, you yourself have to walk the path. The same way Dharampal too would have wanted us to do that. what unfortunately happened was, after Dharampal, very little amount of work has been done in this particular area. For example, the Center for Policy Studies in Madras under Bajaj and MD Srinivas, they did a wonderful work following the path of Dharampal and Annam Pagu Gurvita, and also on the agricultural production and the kind of land distribution that was there in Chengalpatti area. Perhaps most probably that was the only work that followed the path of Dharampal. Beyond that, nothing much has been done, except one person. His name is, I think, James Tooley. He came in 2009. He was a Britisher, I think. And he saw the works of Dharampal. He was an educationist, basically. He was interested in how the poor in the world, they are educating themselves through cost-effective means. So when he chanced to see the beautiful tree, he wanted to research further on that particular thing. And he himself then wrote a book called The Beautiful Tree in 2009. It was published by Penguin. And there he mentions a very interesting and an important thing. It is this: in 1797, there was one Reverend Andrew Bell. He was going for his morning beach walks. Then he saw this ancient Indian school of students sitting under a banyan tree and learning. And there were different periods. The bell was rung between different periods, and then he also saw that they were using very cost-effective methods, and they were getting funded by the local communities and all that. Then he wrote a book in 1797. He went back to London and he wrote this book called Madras Way of Education. And this became an impetus for the cost-effective teaching in England. Their National Institute for Helping the Poor to Learn in England, they adapted the Madras School of Learning, Madras System of Learning, and then they implemented it. So by 1811, this system was getting implemented. By 1821, 300,000 children were studying in England under this Madras School of Education. So just as when they were implementing Macaulay system here, and this Macaulay system was a very centralized way of giving you education. You have the district level, you have a headquarters. At the state level, you have the headquarters. Then you have a headquarters at London. And so everything you have to, it is capital intensive as well as it is bureaucratic. So this system of education is extremely well-controlled education. So when India was subjected to this, the Indian system of education was going there and it was making Britain literate. Okay. So in a way, it is India which made Britain literate. It is not the other way around. Now, this is the kind of research that we have to do, number one. Number two, not only that we have to discover this, how these ancient educational systems worked, then we have to adapt them to the present situation. Particularly with the digital revolution, there is a very vast scope for these decentralized systems to be implemented, readapted and implemented in India. So this is what we mean by going beyond Dharampal. You use Dharampal, and Dharampal has shown you the path. He has opened a big door into our own self, into our own systems, and let us walk into that. But unfortunately, what has happened is we all love to quote Dharampal to gain brownie points over our opponents, which is very good, which is very essential, because there is this great stereotyping of Indian educational system as caste-based, only for the elite and all that kind of thing. It is not so. So we have to show that, but at the same time, we also have to show that this system works even today. We have to adapt it. And for that, we need to do a lot of research that unfortunately we are not yet doing. We have to do that. That is what we mean by this.
You're very much right that we just merely do lip service to Dharampal. And in this context, when you say that it is the Madras education system that ended up impacting education even in Britain, I think Malviya ji also echoes this when he writes his Dissent to the Industrial Commission report. So where he kind of ridicules the English, the colonialists, very harshly and very without any mincing words, saying that even though the Industrial Revolution took place there, but for them to educate, to impart the technological education in their own country, it was a challenging aspect. So in his own words, he mentions it. So when you said that, I got recollected of that. My next question is that we Indians in general are perceived as ahistorical or lacking in history consciousness by the mainstream historians from the West. What is your take on this?
Actually, to answer this, recently I was reading this book by Uwe Swaminathan Iyer on his guru, Sri Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai. Okay. And just for the time of his birth, when Sri Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai was born, if you are a Western historian, you would just write on 18 to this particular year, this particular month, this particular date he was born. Maximum, that is what you would have written. But now, if you take Pillai, his birth, the way Uwe Swaminathan Iyer writes, he gives the entire horoscope. He gives which particular, under which particular nakshatra, which particular tidi, which particular cycle of the moon that he was born. Everything is there. And that goes for at least one page completely when he was born. Okay. So in terms of historical consciousness, the Indian traditional historiography method, despite the charges of it having a lot of Puranic elements in them, is far more better, far superior to the British historiography, that the history way of doing history. I will give you another one example. What was the real name of Shakespeare? What was his identity? Where was he born? He was the greatest poet. But if you go into the real details, still his identity, real identity remains a mystery. So that much you know about historicity in Britain. And further, the history in generally the Western history is written by centralized historians, just like in the case of Islamist history. The historians write it. In the case of India, you will see that every community has its own history in the form of a particular, for want of a better word, a folk song, a folk tradition, which should be enacted. You are from Tamil Nadu, you know very well that almost every community has a Villupattu on a particular day before their Kula Devada, and they give the entire history, and this particular history gets substantiated by inscriptions, by copper inscriptions as well as stone inscriptions in the temples. So here, history is being transferred as a living memory to communities in a very decentralized way, and in a way it can be validated. Of course, you have already reacted with the Sri S. Ramachandran, who would have told you aspects of this particular way of historiography. What we don't have is, we don't have the habit of writing history for the sake of empire or for the sake of a theory. That is what we don't have. And that is what is being told when we are told that we don't have a historic sense. This is what they actually mean. We don't have a vested interest in history writing. That is what actually they mean when they say we don't have a sense of history writing. And when it comes to it, the native scholarship has been excellent in gathering whatever tended to get lost. Okay. For example, we know very well how Nammiyanda Nambi and Rajaraja Chola went and rescued the Thirumarais from getting extinct. That is one example. In our own time, we saw two persons. I will give you an example of two persons. One is Uwe Swaminathan Iyer, very well-known example. Uwe Swaminathan Iyer. He went from village to village and he gathered all these lost treasures of Tamil classic literature. Then you have Chengalvaraya Pillai, who went from the same way, very similar to Uwe Swaminathan Iyer. He went from villages to village, and then he gathered all the Tiruppugal written by Arunagirinatha. So you have here, nobody funded them. There was no government funding them. There was, see, if a missionary is coming here and he is writing history, you know that the entire empire is backing him. When Caldwell came here, Caldwell knows very well he can live in a very simple manner here. Of course, he didn't live in a very simple manner. He even bought a estate here. So he was living in a way he knew very well that he was getting backed up by an empire. Whereas these people, whether it is Uvai Saminatha Iyer or whether it is Sangalvaraya Pillai, these people with no backing, they went from villages to villages, they gathered this and they came out with an excellent version of the lost literary works. So this is how they have been doing. Of course, you can say that this is not exactly history. It is the rescuing of literary traditions, but then literary traditions also have an impact on history. Essentially, they saved history. They saved history. And Dharampal comes in that line, basically. So if you see whether it is Uvai Saminatha Iyer or Sengalvaraya Pillai or let us say Rahami, who was a very great historian of who lived very recently, who was a very great historian who wrote on all our freedom fighters. They all had a very great way of going and exploring, gathering data and getting it to the public. And this is where the history is being done in a very lively manner. In a way, it resonates with the culture of this land.
Either they wiped out the existing history of that colony in order to inject with their version of history. But nevertheless, our sense of history, I mean, even from both Tamil or the Sanskrit literatures, if we see, in the opening remark, what is called as Anubandha Chatushtaya, the person will declare who is he who is writing this particular text. And many times at the end, it will also be there, it will bear a timestamp as to when this was kind of finished. Now, this is definitely a historical data. It is without any kind of personal bias or personal opinion being injected. So my next question is that from the works of these scholars, namely that you have taken, be it Dharampal or Uvai Saminatha Iyer or Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai, from the works of these scholars, we get a picture of our own past where we see that polymath were a commonplace. Now, what kind of an educational environment would have prevailed throughout the country that was responsible in producing such polymaths?
It's a very interesting question. We can only make a guess, but a very informed guess on this. Again, as I said, I was reading this biography of Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai from Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai by Uvai Saminatha Iyer. Here, what we see is this. He studied in Thinnai schools, the corridor schools, the Thinnai Paligudams that Dharampal talks about. So what all the things that he learned there, Uvai Saminatha Iyer gives a picture. Now, Uvai Saminatha Iyer is not writing here to talk about the Thinnai schools. He was just giving, when he was going, he's giving a tangential information about the Thinnai schools, which validate what Dharampal says. In a way, it gives a zoom picture of Dharampal gives a very large quantitative data. And here you have a zoom picture of what actually went on in this particular school. So here what the children were given, any child who goes to Thinnai school, it was given education about basic arithmetic operations, basic mathematical operations, and general literature, reading, writing, of course, general literature. And then, very importantly, see this, they know about the local herbs, how to use the local herbs. Okay. Recently, I have read somewhere that the educational system, the present day educational system, a child before it becomes 8, it reaches the age of 8, it knows at least 50 commercial brands, but it will not be able to identify 5 herbs in its own backyard. Compare this to the system they had then, where the child would be proficient with the local herbs. Okay, then the child can go for its own trade, like it can become a merchant or it can become a farmer or whatever. Or if the person wants to pursue further the education, he has to go to specialist. This is where the things get interesting. Uvai Saminatha Iyer gives a list of 8 pandits to whom Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai went and learned things. Now, these 8 Pandits, they all come from different communities, from different walks of life. Okay, for example, there was one Pandit who was actually a blacksmith. There was another who belonged to color community. And there is another person who used to have a small, what do you call, a thatched palm room in which he used to give medicine. And one Iyengar who worked in Madras Presidency College and later wrote medical treatise, he used to get information from this Pandit who was actually living as a doctor, local physician, and incorporated it into his books. Now, this is the kind of education. This is in one place, Tiruchirapuram, which is Trichy. In this particular place alone, this much number of scholars have lived in different communities. And if you want to get knowledge, you have to go to each and every person like this, and you have to learn how much time it would take, how much efforts it would take. And when you are learning like this, what is the center of your learning? What is it that makes you go and learn all these things? Now, in the case of Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai, it was his love for Saivite literature that made him go. Sri Aurobindo, you would have watched that beautiful documentary called The Genius of India, which was actually taken from the excerpts of Sri Aurobindo's writing. And he says very clearly that the center of India's, the key was essentially spirituality for India to go into any particular discipline. So you go to any particular field. The real thing that motivates you is spirituality. This has become a common culture. Now, if you remember, Albert Einstein said that if you want to do real good science, the basic motivating force should be the cosmic religious feeling. Okay, this cosmic religious feeling comes at a very higher level in the West. And if you look at Einstein himself, it was because of his Jewish background, and it is because of his own interest in Spinoza and all that pushed him towards that cosmic religious feeling. In the case of India, this is something that was there available for everyone. Wherever you want to excel, it is through spirituality that you went and you excelled. So when we talk of Tamil, for example, you talk about Tamil language, you talk about Tamil, the knowledge of grammar, the linguistic, anything. They didn't see Tamil as a language, just a language and identity. They have seen Tamil as a kind of a means for liberation. Education itself was seen as a means of liberation. It was a means to transcend these mortal things and attain immortality, attain liberation. So when this has become your objective, and when you go through this, then naturally you become a polymath. I will give you one very simple example of how this system operated till very recently. Okay, you would have heard the name of Kumara Gurubarar. Kumara Gurubarar was an autistic child. This was around, say, 17th century or something. No, 16th century. He was an autistic child. And then he becomes a child prodigy in singing. And when he comes to Kasi, he wants to go and meet the Mughal administrator who was here, happens to be Tara Shikoh. And when he goes there, the language becomes an impediment. And then he sings this beautiful Sagala Kalavalli Male, which consists of 10 verses. One of the verses he says, Chokkum Porukkum Uira Menyanatin Tot. Essentially, it means you are the thing that animates, the true gnosis that animates the word and the meaning. So what is the relation between the word and the meaning? It is the true gnosis. And what is this true gnosis? It is the reflection of the Brahman, which is the divine feminine of Saraswati. Okay, so this is the thing that he gives. Now, you can understand that this is a very deep aspect, very deep thing. But as children, we learn it at the age of 8 or 10, we learn this. Okay, the thing is, they have sown it into you. And when you grow up, you have an inclination, these things that are deep inside you, they start flowering. Okay, so this is how it happens. The polymath creating system, this is how this happens actually. Once you have cut off the spirituality part, once you have secularized it in a very mechanistic and a very unnatural way, aping the West. Okay, then what happens is the whole thing becomes dry. You cut off the life current to the educational system. Then when you learn Tamil, you cannot get into the inner core of the things. You can learn Kamparama, as a literary thing. You can learn, you can get into the core of, you cannot become Sahridaya of Kambanattalvar. Okay, so this is what happened in the case of our educational system. If our system wants to generate polymaths, you have to bring in this cosmic religious feeling. And that cosmic religious feeling, you don't have to go elsewhere and see. It is already there in each and every temple. It is already there in each and every Devaram, Tiruvasam, Divya Prabandha. You have to just make us realize that these are not just prayers in Abrahamic sense. These are not prayers in the sense of Christianity or Islam. These are the things that just make you get infused with sacredness towards the entire existence. Once you do that, then the system will create a lot of polymaths.
That's a wonderful take. The joke that you shared in the beginning, that a child of 8 years old will remember the commercial brand vis-a-vis remembering the herbs. And finally, when you also touched upon the way we have become very narrow-minded through secularizing this education field per se, I'm only reminded of this another joke, which is also popularly shared in the public, that our education system and departments have become so narrow-minded and so very stringent that even if Gautam Buddha applies to Buddhist studies in a department of Buddhism, he will not be shortlisted because he will not have the required qualification for that. So moving ahead, my next question.
I will just give you another one parallel joke for this. Had Darwin applied to the Department of Science and Technology with his Galapagos Island tour, that would have been also rejected, right?
Very much, very wonderful joinder for that. So from such glorious past, which had this production of polymath, to what we have today as such narrow-minded educational system. My next question is about what has been the colonial intervention's impact on such an effective education system of our past?
I think it was in October 20, 1931. Mahatma Gandhi told in London about the felling of the beautiful tree. In fact, that is why he gave that imagery of a beautiful tree. What the colonial system did was exactly that. It destroyed that, it cut off that beautiful tree. And what it did was it made Indian education more capital intensive and also totally dependent on the bureaucracy. And hence, only the upper layers of the urban population could go to the school and use that particular school. The Thinnai schools, they lost their credibility. For example, if you have studied in a Thinnai school and you apply for a job in company, in East India Company at that time, which was spreading its tentacles everywhere. And then there is another one person who has studied in a missionary school and is applying for the same job. The person who studied in the missionary school or the person who studied in the government school would be preferred than a person who has studied in the Thinnai school. Further, it also created this, that living in your own town, living in your own village has no value. If you study well, you have to go to the nearby town. If you are very good in that town, then you have to go to Madras. If you are very good in Madras, you have to go to Bombay. If you are very good in Bombay, go to Delhi. If you are very good in Delhi, get out of India and go to United States. So the value in being rooted has been destroyed by this particular education. In the case of Indian education, it always looked around you. See, they created Sthala Puranas. If you look at each and every Sthala Purana, you will find that the Sthala Purana has its own language of telling the history of that particular place, the flora, the fauna, the particular community dynamics in that particular place, all that would have been reflected in that Sthala Purana. Why they created Sthala Purana? Why they were not fixated on, like, see, just think about this. We have this famous verse, no, that talks about Gangayil Punidamaya Kaveri, right? We tell that Kaveri is more sacred than Ganga. A Hindu can say that. Can you imagine Islamist telling a particular masjid as sacred than Mecca, sacred than Kaaba? He can't say that, right? Whereas a Hindu can say that. He can say that, you know, the Shiva in my place, the Shiva in my town is sacred to me, more sacred to me than Shiva in Kasi. He can say that. That does not mean I despise Kasi. That means I can concentrate my entire devotion to the local manifestation of the divine, right? And that is very important. So a person who is living in, let us say, Kanyakumari, can consider a Shiva in his own place as very sacred and as very dear to him, right? For example, when Ramana Maharishi was asked to sing on Chidambaram Nadaraja, he said, I am, see, a person like Sri Ramana Maharishi is a complete Advaitin, and he was able to say this, that, you know, my entire life, my devotion is to this non-moving Arunachala and not to that dancing Shiva, right? So this kind of a devotion that is to the local element of the divine, that is something that you see in this culture, and it reflects on everything. So you study the local herbs, you study the local diseases, you study the local social dynamics. You don't create a very big theory and try to put everything into that, pigeonhole everything into that. Now, what the Western educational system, the Western education intervention has created in India is this: the educated person becomes alienated from his own culture. Okay, so actually, you'll be, we are surprised at the kind of terminology they have created. For example, there are informers in social science. You know, a person who studies a particular phenomenon. I have seen this. A person who belongs to that village, the very same village, he is coming there to study the, within single inverted comma, the folk traditions of that village deity, his own deity. And what he needs, informers, academic informers. So he goes to the people, he wants them to get, he gets data from them exactly like how a person who is going to invade you would get the data. So you have these informers. So you get alienated from your own culture. You look at it as if you don't belong to that culture. That does not happen in the case of Europe, in Europe's own history. Think about this. How many Indian who go to United States Western universities, they study the Western cultural phenomena? How many of them study the way the Native American cultures are getting destroyed by Christianization? At the same time, if an Indian goes from India to, let us say, Harvard University, he may most probably submit a thesis on how there is Sanskritization of a particular local deity in India. He won't study that. But at the same time, if a Michael Wetzel comes from Harvard University to India, he would also study only the Indian phenomenon. See, either way, it is always the India that is focused, as if the person who goes from India is also seeing the Indian culture as something different, and the person who comes from outside naturally sees the Indian culture as something different. So this is what the education system has done to us. It has alienated us from our own self. It has created schizophrenics out of us. And because of that, what we do, we start, see, it is at two levels. When you go to school, Vivekananda said it very clearly, when you go to school, the first thing that you learn is that your father is a fool, your grandfather is an idiot, your great-grandfather was a scoundrel. That is what we learn in the school. When we come back, we know that our father is not a fool. We know that our grandfather is not an idiot. We know that our great-grandfather is not a scoundrel, right? So what happens? But you have to write. You have to write, right? In the examination, you have to write. Your own father would say that. The Aryans came here and they brought in superstitions like karma and sacrifice and yajna and everything. They imposed a caste system. We know that it is not true, but we have to write that for the case of 5 marks. Otherwise, you won't get that 5 marks, right? So the cognitive dissonance that this system has created has impacted greatly, not only at the institutional level, but also at the individual level. So we have created the entire mimetic breed of people who have internalized this self-hatred. And that is what now we are seeing, the result. We are harvesting the result of that. And this is what the colonial intervention has done to our education and our society.
What are your proposal to go beyond Dharampal and how it will be useful for our future generations?
I don't know how much I am qualified to give that particular answer. Okay. But I will give you 2 instances where we have creatively adapted the ancient system so that whatever damage that has been done to our society is being reversed. Okay, one is the one teacher school. See, the one teacher school is essentially a you can say diluted reenactment of the night schools. Here the community itself finances the teacher, and the teacher comes and makes sure that the basic education is given to the children. So it has helped a lot in taking literacy to the remotest places where the literacy has been wiped out by this centralized system. Okay, and another one is the midday meals scheme. Only in India you have this concept of students have to get their food from the society. In fact, it was a very interesting system where the students have to go out and beg the food from the society so that they would know what is happening in the society. They were not cut off from the society. Well, there's a very interesting thing here. See, when the first Indian universities under the colonial rule was coming about, okay, there was one guy called Patrick Geddes, who was a polymath. Patrick Geddes was interested in Indian architecture and the traditional Hindu architecture and all that. He studied Kanchipuram, he studied Madurai, how the temple towns have been built, how organically these temple towns have been built and everything. And he gave a plan for the universities, for Indian universities. So of course, the colonial authorities rejected it. Sister Nivedita asked him to write that as a pamphlet. And here he says that the university and the society, they should be intermingling. They should always have this interaction. Whereas in the case of the West, the society and the universities, they never mingle. They live in their own islands. You know, they never understand what is actually happening in the society. That take the example of case of JNU. JNU people live in their own world. They get the theory, and from the theory they are looking at the social universe. They are not getting the knowledge from the social universe and applying it to understand the entire thing, right? So this kind of a bifurcation has happened. Now, coming back to your question, what can be done is this: decentralize at your own level. At our own level, we have to decentralize. How do we do that? One is, in Kanyakumari district, this happened. We had almost every interested Hindu started conducting cultural and religious classes every weekend. So the children always had, for example, in our street, at least there were 2 houses in our locality where the children on Sundays would come and they would sit and they would learn Tevaram, Thiruvasam, and they would learn the Purana stories and everything. And during Vinayaka Chavithi, there would be small functions, there would be small this thing. So like that, interested houses, not every house, interested houses, they can become the epicenter of disseminating our cultural knowledge. That is number 1. Number 2, there was this Bhagavan Sri Satya Sai Baba Samiti. They, whether you agree with him or not is another matter. But this particular scheme they had called Human Values in Education. So they created a schema. We should go for it actually. This particular thing is how to, we are teaching science, for example. When you are teaching science, how you can bring in the values. So they had these values like Satyam, Dharmam, Santi, Prema, Ahimsa. These 5 values. So these 5 values, whether you are teaching a poem, whether you are teaching science, whether you are teaching geography, how to integrate these 5 values into the curriculum. So they had a particular course for this. They started training teachers and things like that. Like that, a lot of researches have been happening in different secluded movements. It doesn't matter whether you agree with that particular movement in totality, but these particular efforts have to be recognized. They have to be taken. They have to be integrated by the government or by the interested persons into mainstream curriculum. If that is done to a large extent, we can actually rectify the damage that has been done to the Indian institutions and Indian psyche. That is, taking good elements in the different spiritual institutions, the experiments that is happening, educational experiments that have been happening in different spiritual institutions. All these are happening, but unfortunately, these are getting locked at a particular level of the society. The government has to take it all. It has to integrate and it has to disseminate. That is a very important thing that we have to do.
Since you invoked I'm a product of that. And in almost every semester, we had an organized way of imparting this human values. And we also had this experience of going out and interacting with others in a village every semester or so. So that really had its impact. And I can assess it, how it helps in harboring ourselves to the ethos and values of the land. So it's very interesting to have this conversation with you where we looked into the works, briefly into the works of Dharampal, the way he had brought out a fresh appearance of the history. And through him, we have also seen other personalities, other equally scholarly archivists like Uwe Swaminathan Iyer, without whom I'm sure the Tamil epics that the top-ranking Tamil politicians are now thumping their chest with would not have been possible to be present amidst us without the efforts of Uwe Swaminathan Iyer. And we also saw...
I'll just tell you one more thing here, that when Uwe Swaminathan Iyer wanted to publish Sivaga Sindhamani, which is essentially a Jain epic, it was a Saivite monastery that financed the entire thing, not the British government, not anybody else. Think about it. A Jain epic that was completely financed by a Saivite monastery. And it was brought by Uwe Swaminathan Iyer. Yeah. Just wanted to add that.
Yeah, that's how we got to know about these personalities. And you also talked about the way the Thinnai education system existed. So for the benefit of our listeners, Thinnai school is a Tamil word, and which had its perhaps genesis for the system that our government also had invoked throughout the country, called as Anganwadi system, which of course started as a school, but then now it has turned into a daycare for small infants. But this national education policy again has got some fresher approach towards it. So, and you also gave us very nice methods by which we can take it forward from individual level in order to decentralize the knowledge and spread it within our immediate neighborhood. So with that, we come to a close of this conversation, and we hope that we get to interact with you more. I, on my personal behalf and behalf of Atharva Forum, thank you, express my gratitude for your time and for your nice words. Thank you very much, Arvindan ji. Namaste.